Good, okay. Welcome, everybody. We were waiting a few minutes after lunch for those who are a bit late. Welcome, everybody, to the panel on the young generation's perspective of space and security. It is my distinct pleasure, really, to welcome this distinguished and very diverse panel today. My name is Chris Vasco, and I'm a research fellow with the European Space Agency, and I will be co-moderating the panel today. This panel came together because young people tend to get together and network, and the Space Generation Advisory Council and Young ESA formed a cooperation a few years ago to allow the interaction of young people with distinguished space specialists. And I'm very happy to see fellow space generers here on the stage. This balanced panel is necessary in order to be able to address a very multifaceted and complex topic such as space and security. And it's necessary to involve different organizations and backgrounds to be able to consider all the viewpoints that are essential to bring up. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my co-moderator, Cristina Giannopapa, who's the head of the Political Affairs Office at the European Space Agency. Cristina.
Thank you very much, Chris. Can I please have the slides? So when we talk about space and security, the word security is something which is very different in different languages. In some languages, there is a separation between safety and security. In others, it is the same. And at the same time, there are many nations who understand something completely different with the word security. So if we look at things from the seamless chains of citizens' protection, because at the end of the day we talk about protecting the citizen, if we have on the left-hand side safety and on the right-hand side defense, security is somewhere in between. But then who does what? Typically, you would have the civil entities dealing more with the safety aspects and the defense entities dealing with the defense aspects. And then you have security somewhere in between. So who deals with that? Well, there the borders are very blurry, so it is not very clear who does what. But what we definitely don't want is that things fall through the cracks because nobody is responsible and nobody takes care. And it is also better to understand the links between them in order to ensure that there are synergies which at the end benefit the citizen. And I think that this will definitely be something we will elaborate through our discussions today. So the European Space Agency was also asked by its member states, security, what do you mean by this word? Everybody in the Council has been debating and discussing what is security, and they asked us to come back and say what is space safety and security for us. And the European Space Agency understands it with two components, security in space and security from space. When we talk about security, safety and security in space, we talk about space debris, space weather, planetary defense, collision avoidance, so to ensure that we have the possibility to access space safely. When we talk about space safety and security from space, then it is the very soft side of space and security and safety. So it is about water security, about food security, disaster management, safe maritime. And when we talk about both, overall, we have to ensure that cybersecurity is taken care at all points. And with that, this is the introduction to this and to our discussions, and I will start with the questions to our panelists and introducing you. So, I would like to go to Dorina Antoni. She's from Eindhoven University of Technology. She's doing a PhD, and she was one of the experts that engaged in the SGAC activities before the conference, and we will be glad to hear the results from this very interesting topic.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Cristina, for the introduction. The delegates of the working group, of the SGAC working group on space safety and security, have had deliberations for 3 days on this challenging topic, as Cristina just highlighted, and the main conclusion was that there is a need for space traffic management. We looked into the definition of space security, the stakeholders' involvement and the different governance schemes, including top-down and bottom-up approaches for the establishment of space traffic management. In this regard, there have been several proposals for guidelines, rules of the road, and binding international treaties. However, these regulatory approaches take time to be implemented, while the need for space traffic management is quite urgent. In this regard, the working group stressed the need to come up with concrete measures that facilitate immediate implementation at national and international level. In these discussions, we have been inspired by existing structures and principles, such as the principle of international cooperation as enshrined in the space law framework, but also we have looked into comparable traffic regimes, such as air traffic, maritime traffic, and frequency management. We additionally looked into the roles of existing organizations, such as the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Seabed Authority, and the International Telecommunication Union. In formulating our recommendations in a concrete manner, we were based on the recently adopted 9 additional guidelines on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, as reached consensus a couple of months ago at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. Therefore, the recommendations we came up with are the following. First, we consider important the establishment of a single entity as a single point of contact at international level. This entity, we came up with the name of a National Regulatory Authority, should be able to comprehensively consult and able to converge the diverse interests at international level, including all the stakeholders involved in space and security. The stakeholders include the industry, academia, government, civilian and military actors, as well as non-profit and NGO organizations. The second recommendation we came up with is the need for information sharing at national level and international level. All countries should be able to establish a comprehensive framework for a space traffic management system by integrating their individual capacities at international level. And that would include data collection, data processing, data products, and data sharing. The third recommendation we came up with is the need for establishment of domestic incentives that further facilitate the establishment of international regulatory regimes. And that means that all countries should provide domestic encouragement for space traffic management through incentives, including, but not limited to, sharing data, tools, and best practices, reduced registration fees through licensing systems, preferential access to launch schedules, research, development, engineering, and business development support from national agencies. These recommendations come at a moment of a very critical need for space traffic management, and these recommendations echo the recent signature of the Memorandum of Understanding for the need for further collaboration in space traffic management as signed at the opening ceremony of this International Astronautical Congress between the IAF, IAA, and IASL. We hope that these recommendations will provide the basis for further establishment of space traffic management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorina. This is indeed quite interesting recommendations that the working group managed to conduct in a very, very short period of time. I had the pleasure to be in the room as well and see how you guys work together in the different groups and using very agile methods to come with conclusions. So very, very modern way of actually creating strategy and recommendations was really excellent. Thank you. Now, We hear a lot of things from you also in terms of the governance, the different aspects, the different actors. I would like to introduce Didier Schmidt, who is part of the European External Action Service and a very, very long experience in the space matters, and in particularly also in the field of safety and security. And I would like to ask Didier, how should the governance look like, provided that we have all of these sovereign interests from the various member states, and it's quite a sensitive topic. So how do you see this evolution taking place? Thank you.
Thank you. That's probably a conference in itself. I think I will use the analogy with the air traffic management. Imagine an airport where you see everything coming in, coming out. You extend a little bit your radar capability and you see the military planes flying around. Then imagine you do this at the national level. You see everything happening, you know, everything that flies, drones, private planes, military, everything. And then extend this to worldwide, where at any time you know anything which flies in the air. And you know exactly where it is, where it goes. Obviously, you don't always know what they do, but you know where they are. That's just to tell, this is what space traffic management is about at the end, is to know everything that flies in space, depending on your capabilities, radar and so on. You can see everything bigger than 10 centimeters or less, which means that you can follow 1 million objects. Of course, obviously all satellites, which means that you see everything. You have every orbit that you can follow, and obviously you can put a tag on it. You can know whether it's a military, a civilian, God knows what kind of satellite. And then you can see satellites which you don't know what they are, but they move around. You know, they nearly pop into others. Just to tell you, it's like being aware of everything. And then the problem is who should be aware of everything and who can be allowed to be aware of everything. And this is the very, very big problem with space traffic management. You have heard a president that I will not name because he said he wants a space force. It is very obvious that wherever you look at, space will become more and more militarized, whatever you do. So you can imagine that if there is an entity in charge, as you said, maybe a single entity, maybe information sharing and so on, it will be awfully difficult to agree on something like this because of the implications for the defense sector. It's very, very simple. Therefore, we have to find ways. We haven't found any proper way yet in Europe. There are so many actors, the European Union. They may have the money, but it's difficult to, it's a very purely civilian organization, of course. We have ESA, also a civilian, but with defense capabilities, which are not excluded by the convention. You have, of course, national interests, and so on. So we haven't found yet the mechanism. I mean, Europe is awfully more complex than other countries, like China or the US and so on. So we have additional factors to take into account. So that's why I'm saying I don't have the solution yet, but I have to explain you the complexity of the equation.
Thank you very much, Didier. Indeed, it is quite a complex puzzle, and particularly from the European side. And you mentioned also the role of the member states and how much they play a role in deciding how the evolution will be and the link between civil and military in the future. So with that, I would like to go further to Jeroen Glazen, who is representing one of the member states, the Netherlands. He's from the Netherlands Space Office, and he can provide us with his views on how this topic should be evolving in relation to the government, industry, space agencies, and what role they play and should be playing for this collaboration. Jeroen.
So thank you, Christina, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. The title is The Young Generation's Perspective. I'm probably at least twice as old as anybody who is part of this younger generation. Maybe that's because you think you can get two for the price of one. In that case, you're welcome. But security space, Christina already
You're not the only one.
Touched on it.
I don't know where I belong.
Christina already touched on the point about the definition of security. The English language is quite unique in that usually it has for every single thing at least 2 or 3 words to describe it. In this case, it's the other way around. We have just one word to describe totally different things. And that makes it both confusing and also quite a complicated subject. But it is a very important subject, and that's the reason why we're here. Security forms an integral part of space policy and space activities. The assets that we have up there and the systems are critical to ensuring security on Earth. This is what we call security from space. I'll come to each of these in turn. At the same time, these assets need to be protected, the satellites that we have in space. In the difficult environment of outer space, it's not a nice place to live. This is what we call security of space. But there are not only threats space poses to humans, but also the other way. And that is purposeful interference with space assets. And this is what we term security in space. I hope you're still following this. Let me take these one by one. Security from space. Space faces constantly evolving security threats that are more diverse, less visible, and less predictable than before. The reason that we are doing this at this moment is because it is such an important subject. Security 20, 30 years ago was a sort of side thought. It was not a core business. Now everything we do in space has to be done either with security in mind or as a part of a security system. To deal with these, it needs the capabilities for sound decision-making, prevention policies, and effective action. Space assets provide a significant contribution to confronting these threats through global monitoring, communication, and positioning capabilities. Just 2 examples of European programs which we are involved in, and both the European Commission and ESA, of course, in the first instance. Copernicus, that's the Earth observation program that is implemented by Europe. It improves emergency response, global stability, and homeland security by contributing to maritime surveillance, border control, and global food security. A recent example, of course, is the tsunami in Sulawesi in Indonesia. Despite all the loss of life, it would have been far greater had it not been both for the warnings that were given or can be given in those instances, and the work that Earth observation does to help those who are affected. We have Galileo, the global navigation satellite system, which will facilitate civil protection in harsh environments, speed up rescue operations for people in distress, and provide tools for Coast Guard and border control authorities. It will also enable new security-related applications that can help locate stolen property and even lost pets. Then security of space. Space-based products and services rely on satellites, can't emphasize it enough, which must be monitored and protected against threats to ensure a safe and uninterrupted service. At the same time, people on Earth must also be protected against space hazards. We don't live in a cocoon here, we live in space, and there are hazards there, such as asteroid strikes. Being informed about the situation in space is referred to as space situational awareness. Again, covers a number of things. Space debris, man-made material that's orbiting and still orbiting. We're making more and more of it as it degrades, it gets in smaller pieces, but you have to realize even a speck of paint carries more energy than a 9mm bullet at that speed. There are expected to be around 1 million of these objects in space by 2020. There can be a point where we simply cannot go to space anymore. We need to identify and track these debris. This is known as space surveillance and tracking, also very important and upcoming part of our activities, mostly based on ground sensors. We assess the risk of in-orbit collisions, detect and characterize in-orbit fragmentation, breakups, or collisions, all of which will contribute to even more debris. Then we have space weather. There is weather in space. It is a vacuum, but there is certainly weather. Changes in the Earth's magnetic field, radiation from solar winds, space storms made of energetic particles or electromagnetic radiation. These can cause major failures on satellites, but they can also, and increasingly with miniaturization of electronics, severely damage ground-based systems, such as power grids, and even computers and our own cell phones, which we rely on so desperately. Then we have something else which people may not always be aware of. Near-Earth objects, asteroids or comets that come close to Earth, some of which have already taken care of the dinosaurs. We want to avoid the situation that the humanity faces the same fate. These also are addressed in research projects. These are done both by ESA and the EU under the framework programs. And ESA has its own situational awareness program. Then last, perhaps not least, security in space. You have nothing if you don't have the assets. Cybercrime is a problem not only on Earth. Increasingly complex and networked systems are also increasingly vulnerable to the bad guys. Galileo is an example. Security was initially an afterthought. Now it is actually the main cost driver for the whole system. That ends the overview. I hope I've given you some idea of the complexity involved, but also two things. It is very important. It's something that we need to consider constantly and even more in the future. But also realize that on all levels, a lot is being done, and a lot of thought and effort is being expended into this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. You actually gave us a fantastic overview of the different facets of safety and security in space and from space, with the different aspects of the definition as well in the debate. And also, this brings us to the thing that also Didier mentioned, that we have the facet of the civil and the defense element to it, and the importance to also look at it further. So we have with us Martin Adriaansen, who is a Space Policy Officer at the European Defence Agency, and he can provide us with a view on how synergies could take place between space, safety, security, and defense. Martin.
Thank you, Christina. It's a very complicated question, and terminology as dual use is very often used in this regard. And I would like to distinguish, in fact, between dual use of technology and dual use of assets and services. When we are talking about technology development, and especially at lower technology readiness levels, in fact, there is little or no difference that should be made in technology that could lead to both civil or military applications. So when we're talking about R&D funding, we need to keep open options to both serve civil as well as defense-oriented applications. And if we are looking at a user perspective of space assets, services we have already in place, we have to say that already ministries of defense are already using space-based data and services coming from civilian assets, both public as well as commercial. We can also say that ministries of defense and armed forces, depending on the country, also have important roles when it comes to civil protection, crisis management, or disaster management. And we also see more and more satellite systems that are co-funded by both civil as well as defense stakeholders and co-utilized as well. So when we're talking about synergies, we need to make sure that policymakers and decision makers take into account both dual-use technology as well as the assets and services, and make sure that we create an ecosystem in which the synergies between civil and defense sector can prosper. Finally, I would like to mention the EU Global Strategy on Foreign and Security Policy and the European Defence Action Plan, which further echo the need to further have these synergies between civil and defense sector and maximize the efforts we put in there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. We see that there is the link and the merger of the blurring borders, but what actually happens is often these borders are merged within the industry that actually develops the various assets. And we have with us a representative from Airbus. So I would like to welcome Jan Gui, I hope I pronounced it correct, the Deputy Head of Space Tech Team, and we would like to hear from you. What is the industry view in this regarding how space safety and security aspects go together? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first, I think that space is a resource that belongs to humankind and that we need to use for safety and security on Earth. And that we need to use in a very sustainable manner so that we can use it for a long time for our safety and security. So what does the industry do? Actually, we already do a lot of things on our own initiative, as we are using this resource for commercial purposes, but also for providing service to governments, but also to people, improving the security. I'll give you an example. So today we're improving our designs to remove, not to leave any debris in space, to leave a clean space, but we are providing also imagery. We're providing secure telecommunication to support disaster management and also projection of governmental services abroad. So I think there is a great deal of things that we do that are known. There are things that we do that are less known. Maybe, I don't know if you heard about the Satellite Data Association, where there is already a sharing of data between satellite operators to manage the risk of collisions and to manage the risk of debris. So let's say there is an initiative, and we advocate for a level playing field, so an homogeneous framework, so that all the actors can actually develop a commercial use that implements the standards and handle space safety in space, but also provide best services for safety on Earth.
Well, thank you. That's actually a key role for all young professionals for us is to understand both sides of the playing field. So working in industry is usually the step how we get into space and how we start understanding these concepts. And I'm very happy to introduce a fellow, formerly young ESA engineer, actually, who works on rockets going into space. Aline, can you help us understanding what lessons can be drawn from past and current initiatives in space safety and security from your point of view?
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm a rocket scientist, so I will probably help to answer this question by using some space transportation experiment that I got. Actually, if we try to draw the status that the current safety criteria that we have today for space transportation, we have actually many regulations based on expertise and lessons learned, like best practices from knowledge and expertise that have been brought for years. We have one international one, which is based on ISO regulations, so the International Space Organization that did a set of guidelines for safety. But mostly all the other ones are national and initiatives from space agencies and institutions. So it means that basically they answer to their own purpose or their own project that they get. There's only one which is regulated by law, which is the French space law. It regulates the way to operate and launch a rocket from a crew, with the payload inside, of course. But actually, this is the only one which is regulated by law or made applicable by law. So in fact, you have many regulations that need to evaluate for the space mission, and in particular for next space exploration missions. Of course, there will be outstanding projects, so they will be done around new technologies with new organizations. So this is an international cooperation that will be needed in order to put together all the pieces that will make the space system itself. But the new challenge that we have to face in safety and security in general will be to draw an international consensus around what should be safety. If I take some illustration on that, for example, if you're going to the moon or Mars, what should be the probability of the loss of crew, for example, or what should be the mitigation of the generation of space debris, or what should be the good propulsion systems to be used in order to reduce or prevent a little bit from the radiation for the crew and reduce the duration of the mission during the journey. So this kind of high-level requirement that we need to try to draw all together. And I just would like to take one example of one regulation that can maybe be beneficial in order to improve and mature the safety criteria for space. This is the civil aviation that has been matured through decades for improvement and maturation, and they matured also thanks to millions of hours of flight per year. And actually what is very interesting here is the logic of construction of the safety criteria that they are using, because actually they achieved to have safety criteria that are used and agreed worldwide. They are not just applicable, they are recognized and applied. If you take the example of you fly from Paris to China and you fly over Russia, for example, you don't plan to stop at the border of Russia in order to take another plane because the regulation is not applicable in Russia, and you don't want to take another plane also at the border of China in order to final a trip. So basically what you want to do here is have a really joint effort, because when we will talk about space exploration and deep space exploration to go to Mars, what do you really want to do is to have one spacecraft, maybe go directly to the moon or directly to Mars. You don't want to have some gates in order to stop and say, okay, the regulation is not applicable for you. And you even want to have a crew. It can be 5 people or 100 persons. And you want to have different nationalities in your spacecraft. So you need to have agreed of what should be the acceptable level of loss of crew when you build your spacecraft in a way that it's agreed and recognized by everybody. So I think that it can fed using what is done for aviation, civil aviation. It can fed this logic and help to construct and build and elaborate a little bit on the space safety for space exploration.
Thank you. As always, it's surprising how quickly you come from a simple engineering problem of putting something somewhere in some orbit to a very complex question for regulation and international cooperation. That is always a surprise. It's good that you mentioned that we can take direct flights from A to B because we have regulation in place, because we have someone who can maybe give us a different outlook on how this is. Because we are actually joined on the panel today by Eleanor Morgan, who's a US Air Force reserve officer and a pilot herself. And if this is yet another aspect how we young professionals can actually get exposed to these topics, because sometimes we do choose a military career, and I'm very curious to see how you see the role of safety and security, specifically while maintaining that hint of and the essence of peaceful purpose.
Thanks, Chris, and great question. And thanks again for having me on the panel. I realize I have a bit of a different background than most people here. So real quick, let me just recap my background so you kind of understand the framework of where I personally am coming from. And my disclaimer, as an Air Force officer, these are my own personal views, not the views of the US Air Force Reserve, I have to say that. But yeah, so my background, I flew transport planes for several years, C-17s, supporting various missions around the world. I've worked in the Combined Air and Space Operations Center in the Middle East, helping with many of our wartime operations there. I have also transitioned into flying what you know as drones, what we like to call remotely piloted aircraft. Drones is a dirty word for us. So RPAs, that's what I'll refer to them as. So I've also had a chance to do that over the years as well, and that's given me a very interesting perspective on many things and drawn me much closer to many aspects of space and security. And then I also worked as a mission director in our operations center, overseeing our global RPA operations around the world. And they are everywhere. So anyways, that's just kind of, that's where I'm coming from, so you kind of understand my thoughts on this. I think we've all talked about some great points here with regards to space safety and security. I think both of those, overlap in my area. In the area of safety, frequency management was discussed. That is actually a huge thing right now as we increase the amount of unmanned aerial vehicles around the world, even commercially. That is beginning to be something we need to figure out. And I've personally run into issues where frequencies have not been deconflicted, causing an aircraft to go lost link, perhaps causing a safety issue with a manned aircraft. So there's many things that can come into play, and frequency management as well for radio communications is essential in any type of safe flying environment. As far as the security aspect, probably the big thing for us, with my background right now is kind of the cybersecurity and the security of our satellites and the frequencies. That's something I believe the military in general is finally beginning to wrap their heads around, is kind of our vulnerabilities at times with regards to the frequencies that we use. They aren't always on secure satellites. And we begin to realize that people understand, especially now that with the remotely piloted aircraft, there's people out there jamming satellites and jamming certain frequencies, and that can cause lots of disruption, from planes to communications with troops on the ground that may be taking fire that we need to support. So there's a lot of safety issues involved with that as well, and that's something that I was very interested in. So I also have training in and being an electronic combat officer for our unmanned aircraft, and learning more about that aspect and what we can do to harden up and kind of beef up our security for our frequencies. So both of those overlap in many ways. Disaster management was also discussed here. And I've had a lot of experience when I was flying C-17s, supporting humanitarian relief operations in other countries, and also doing medical evacuations. And sometimes, maybe they were for foreign nationals. And so that is a huge thing as well. So we talk about, how do I see this, maintaining the essence of peaceful purpose? Well, yes, I am involved in war. However, I think it really depends on what angle you come at it from. And for me, my background and things that I've done, I do it to provide peace and safety for the people that perhaps are unable to defend themselves or in a bad position. And so whether that's bringing in food and water to them, whether that's providing overhead surveillance to ensure that women and children of a foreign nationality are kept safe by people, gunning them down. I have seen many things, and that, I think, at the end of the day is, that's where I see the still maintaining a peaceful purpose. And we also talked about sharing data. We talked about the importance of imagery, and that's very important at times for things with remotely piloted aircraft and supporting people on the ground and around the world, having up-to-date imagery, because that can be the difference between perhaps releasing a weapon into a hospital versus a compound that's creating weapons. So along those lines as well, I think, with the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aspect, I think that's also important for us to hold each other accountable, as far as nuclear deterrence as well. I think at the end of the day, we want to maintain a peaceful planet and keep people safe, and that's what I like to think about. That's what kind of carries me on day to day in my jobs. When I see some things that aren't the best, I sleep at night knowing I'm not in the business of taking lives. I'm in the business of saving lives. So thanks.
Thank you. Well, this is certainly at the cutting edge of technology and also of space technologies and their applications, dealing from everything from cybersecurity to big data. which is actually a beautiful analogy for a young entrepreneur trying to understand what he or she can do for space. As the complexity increases and the time step and the time frame accelerates over the time, young, new, fresh ideas are needed. And that allows me to welcome a young entrepreneur here on stage. We are joined today, I hope I pronounce it right, by Narayan Prasad. And he is the co-founder of SatSearch Co. He will tell us about it in a minute. I'm particularly interested, how do you see our social responsibility to maintain safe and sustainable engagement in space activities?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for the question. So it's a very interesting topic because in the last few years, I would say that the commercial sector has more or less taken over a lot of the drive in space, and commercial money has taken over a lot of the drive. And because of this, you have these potential new constellations that are coming up. And at the same time, we have an intersection with space policy or the lack of concrete laws, which brings up the angle of social aspects of an entrepreneurial space. Because I believe that if there are very clear laws, like for example, if the IADC mandate says now the 25-year rule is now a complete law, that brings clarity to entrepreneurs because then it's a law that you have to follow. But because these are recommendations and a lot of it is debatable and there's no international consensus on several issues in space security, that brings up the whole angle of social responsibility of companies. So I think that there are a few things that companies are trying to do in order to make themselves look socially responsible in space exploration. One of the examples that I can give is of like companies like Planet, for example, who are trying to fly in low Earth orbiting orbits to essentially to be responsible in terms of deorbiting the entire constellation and so on. But I think what would be interesting to see in the future is to see if companies can actually have things like beacons, which are standardized on standardized protocols that, given that the satellites are also getting smaller, bigger, you never know what is the size of them nowadays. So if there are these beacons which are standardized and you can possibly look at tracking all of these beacons in a globally, global traffic platform, which very similar to some of the things that have happened in the air traffic management realm. So you will have to see if companies can adopt some of that. And the end of life, again, is deorbiting has become more or less very clear that it's still kind of not really compulsory, but it's so on. But then there's also a role for the governments or the nation states here if they can try to incentivize entrepreneurs to do something to be more socially responsible as well, because there's no international consensus in all of this. But can nation states themselves be kind of more give them a subsidy on something or subsidize the whole thing? And as far as the new things are concerned, where it comes to space traffic management in sensors and platforms and data management or in cybersecurity and so on, today there are also the private sector entering into all of these realms where people are looking at having their own sensors, their own independent stations, their own platforms. And there is no global consensus also on this because some countries would prefer having this as state-driven or government-driven, and some countries would say, we don't mind having the commercial sector operating in this. But again, with this, there comes the conflict as to what happens if one advisory provides one kind of a report and then the other advisory brings the other kind of report, and then there's two conflicts in that, and who depends on what kind of advisory. So again, you would look at some sort of standardizing and creating a global protocol for all of this. So there is, I believe, a lot of work to be done in all of these, and we'll have to see how there is a broad consensus at all different levels.
Okay, thank you. So now we have the opportunity and time to open this panel up for questions. If someone has questions, you can, I see the organizers already coming with microphones. You can just stand up and ask for a microphone. Do we have some questions? Yes, here in the front, 2 people. Yes.
Please also say to who you would like to address the question from the panelists.
Yes, sure. Didier Allary from Airbus. My question is to you, Didier, but also a mention to the excellent speech of Mrs. Anthony. We have presented yesterday a paper jointly co-authored by several people from the Legwell and from the Space Policy Institute about the need of an international organization mimicking the ICAO that would take all the layers of the normative layer, the license registration, the fees, etc. So I do agree with you, and I recognize your parallel work in this arena. One layer is the space situational awareness, the awareness of the traffic. And this is now my question to Didier. Didier, you mentioned that putting a radar, you will get all the objects in your field of view, and you will see then the scientific mission, the debris, the civilian mission, and the military. But I would say if you put a radar on ground, you will catch all the planes, whatever they are, including the military. If you put a radar on the sea, you will see all the ships, including the military. And maybe if you are clever enough, you will put under the sea and you will see the submarines as well. So my question is that could we just simply imagine that we start the space situational awareness for this Space Traffic Management International Organization just on the civilian side, as the ICAO, the C stands for civilian. Maybe we should think about an ICSO where it is International Civilian Space Organization and restrict the mandate of this organization, at least for the first 10 years, let's say, just for civilian application and leaving the military do their business.
Yes. The thing is that you need a filter, and the filter, who will be the filter, you know? You have to filter out the civilian part. I mean, I have been in the French control center for aerospace and space. I could see everything. But of course, they wouldn't show everything to everybody. So you need, and they have a filter. So that is a real problem, is who will at the end have the whole picture, filter out the civilian part and give it away, so to say, for public good, which is fine. So that is the real question. The end result, we do agree on the end result. This is all fine. But, you know, devil is in the detail, and here the detail is quite big, is who will be the filter. And internationally, it's very difficult to do, because everybody has very different interests, you know, in space traffic management and SSA, SST, as we name it. So that is the core issue. As long as you have a sensor, whatever it is, radar can be also optical in orbit and so on. And then how far do you go? You know, to monitor. You can just say it's a point, but then you can go even further. What exactly is it? What kind of orbits and so on? So that is the real difficulty again. We will have to find a mechanism. We have tried to find a mechanism in Europe by financing programs where we give money to member states to improve their capability, to see whether we can have a synthesis of all of this, and then extract the data for the civilian. If we don't do it, somebody else will do it. In the US, Department of Commerce has already given even the green light to start commercial operations of space data. So at a certain stage, it will happen. So we have, in Europe at least, to have put our act together as well. And then, of course, we have to do it globally at one point. This is for sure.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Dan Perry. I study international security and arms control. And first, I'd just like to thank all the panelists for being here. And this is for whichever one of you would like to weigh in. And my question is, how can we maintain stable nuclear deterrence and control escalation of the space arms race when powerful nations like Russia and the United States act in violation of international law or break arms control treaties? Thank you.
I think that Didier can give a short answer representing the External Action Service, even though I think this is a little bit beyond the scope of this panel.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I mean, the thing is what you address is mostly suborbital issues. The arms control and so on, and the ballistic missile, that doesn't reach the outer atmosphere, the outer space. So the law applicable is completely different. Space law is above 100 kilometers, and all the rest is below. So it's a very, very different issue, because then it's national issues. If you go with a ballistic missile over a country, it's the national law which applies, not the space law.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yeah. Hello. So my question is to not anyone in particular, but I would appreciate as many viewpoints from the panelists as possible. So my question is, what do space and security mean to countries which are prioritizing using space applications, or let's say space assets, for solving their problems rather than prioritizing a military approach? For instance, countries like Egypt or even India, they use space applications and space to solve their common people's problems. So what does space and space security mean to them differently?
Thank you for the question. Maybe we get an answer from Didier again.
I think the answer is relatively straightforward, at least one angle of it. If you send into space whatever satellite you have, or swarm of satellites in the future and so on, you want them to be safe. You don't want to send them twice. You want them to operate as long as you have foreseen to operate them. Then imagine you have a nice big satellite there, and its lifetime is 5 years because of the onboard fuel and so on. And every now and then, somebody will tell you, hey, by the way, move it up, move it down, put it away, because something else is close to it. We will not tell you what, but you have to move your satellite. And then from the 5 years lifetime, you get to a 3 years lifetime because of these movements, Okay. If you are blind and you don't know why you have to move, you have no say. So that's why it's good to have a very global information, so that everybody knows who is where, and not just someone knowing everything and everybody else is blind.
Yeah, and as this topic also touches a lot of what Jeroen said in relation to applications, disaster management, which is also a topic a lot for many of the emerging countries, maybe we can hear your views as well to that, Jeroen.
Well, I think Didier has already covered most of the most important points here. But absolutely, we see from the perspective of the Netherlands Space Office that the use of Earth observation data, especially in these kinds of countries, is taking an enormous flight. We support at the moment a project to help small farmers in Africa, which is highly successful. So with very low technology, at least low technology on the ground, they're able to do a lot of things which they were not able to do beforehand in terms of usage of water, fertilizer, and so on, and make their production much higher. So yes, there too it is important. The security of the continuity of that kind of information, particularly once you've become used to having it, is absolutely essential.
Thank you. We maybe have time for another question, if we do have one. Yeah, in the back.
Yes, hello. I have a question about the European stance on space security. Before Mr. Didier mentioned about the fact that now the European Union is sponsoring the single countries through the AU-SST consortium. I was wondering whether in the years to come it will change this approach, because recently there was a new draft of the regulation, for instance, for the European GNSS agency, where among the others also SSA were tackled. So I wanted just to have your view, your perspective on how in the years to come the European approach will evolve. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very specific question that we can address maybe on a bilateral later on. I think globally for the audience, indeed the issue now is to have a political decision on how we do finance and therefore how we implement. And obviously, you know, if the European Union finances, they are setting the rules. So obviously, we have to find a way to integrate, of course, the member states because they have the capacities today. We have to see how we do it with ESA because they are obviously one of the big players as well. There has been the first studies on SSA have been done in 2009 already. So all of this has to take shape. We have to have, if the EU pays most of it, it will be EU rules. So it will be a dedicated program. For the time being, there is no decision because we are still in discussion with the member states how we will do it.
Thank you very much, Didier. And I think we are arriving to the end of our very interesting discussions and panel. We have had a very diverse panel with a 3G diversity in terms of definitely gender, geography and generation, and this shows a fantastic cooperation that Young ESA and SGAC have established, and congratulations for putting the panel together. Now, space is without borders, and it is for everyone. We see that it is necessary, and we have heard it a couple of times from the United States already, we have heard it from Europe, and it came up as a conclusion as well from your exchanges before the Congress, that we do need a space traffic management. And that is going to engage different type of aspects of safety and security, bringing them together. The question is, do we take a bottom-up approach with different type of rules, engineering, etc., or do we go from a top-down approach where we progress to go and define a treaty and also related organizations which will engage in it and afterwards be able to be the guardians of this treaty. What is clear from what we have heard is that not one size fits all, and it's still a very open question to what would develop. Now, one thing that I hear from all of you is that whatever we do, we need to keep in mind that space is for everyone. It's a global common, it's for everyone. It's for our prosperity, it's for our socioeconomic development, it's part of our everyday life. And we need to ensure that we have the privileges we have taken from it, it should also be there available for all the next generations. And looking forward to see you all at another occasion in another panel. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.